following 7 cases are about people who received a phone call from a deceased person or had spoken to someone on the phone only to find out later that they had spoken to a deceased person. Case number 1. Greg's grandfather had passed away many years ago, but he'd had a very strange experience when he arrived home one day. He decided to check the caller ID on his phone, and his deceased grandfather's name appeared. He just assumed that someone had called from his grandfather's old house and thought nothing of it. However, one day at work his phone rang, and he picked it up on the first ring, but all he could hear was a dial tone. When he checked the phone directory, it showed who had made the call, and his grandfather's name appeared again. Was his grandfather attempting to communicate with him? Case number 2. A woman was working for the Department of Social Services, and one of her jobs was issuing checks for emergency expenses. On one occasion, she sent out a check for $100 for a client's utilities. She had no sooner closed the woman's file when the phone rang. At the end of the line was the woman she just issued the check to, and the woman sounded distant, vague and distracted, and said, "I won't be needing the $100 after all." The worker duly noted the call, cancelled the check and continued working. That evening she was reading the local newspaper and came across the obituary of the woman she had talked to on the phone that day. She found she had died 2 days previously. Case number 3. A woman by the name of Bonnie had lost her mother 3 years previously and was extremely saddened as they were very close, and there was not a day that passed where she did not miss her. That Christmas, Bonnie went to bed and was suddenly awoken by a phone ringing. As she picked up the phone, the voice said, "Hello there," and she immediately recognized the voice at the other end. It was her mother's voice. The line had a static noise that would cut in and out. Bonnie exclaimed, "This can't be you, Mum, you're dead." Her mother replied, "Oh, come on now," and sounded a bit annoyed, and then they were cut off. Bonnie knew it was her mother's voice as she had a Norwegian accent, and she was certain it was her mother. Case number 4. One stormy evening, a man received a call at about 1:57 a.m, and as he answered the call, all he could hear was a series of bleeps, but nobody spoke. Then the line went dead. He called the number back on the caller ID, and it said, "This number is not in service." Strangely though, his wife was sleeping next to him and never heard the ring, which she normally would have as she was a light sleeper. It appears that her husband was the only one to hear the ring. A couple of hours later, the exact same thing happened to his mother, where at 4 a.m. she was awoken by the phone ringing. His mother heard the same bleeps and found it was the same caller ID, and when she called back, it said "not in service." Strangely though, the man's brother lived with his mother and never heard the phone ringing. Only his mother could hear the ringing. However, at about 5 a.m, his mother was lying in bed and saw a man standing at the foot of the bed staring at her. She said he was tall and thin with dark eyes and dark clothes. After staring at her for about a minute, he suddenly moved across the room and vanished. The family was all totally confused and could not work out how both mother and son received the same type of call on the one night, followed by the mother seeing what appeared to be the apparition of a man in her room. Nothing like that had happened before to them. The wife could not work out why she and the man's brother had not heard the phone ring, as they were both in close proximity to the phone. It should have woken them up like an alarm clock. The only thing they could put it down to was that the man's brother had died 6 months previously and was trying to communicate with them. If this was the case, why did the mother not recognize the apparition at the end of her bed as possibly being her dead son, unless she was too terrified at the time? Case number 5. One day when Crystal was at her mother's house, she decided to call her friend Jessica, who lived close by. At the time of the call, her friend was staying at her cousin's house, so she had to look up the number in the phone directory. Her surname was Owens, and she was the only one in the directory, which made it easy to find. Crystal then rang the number, and it was immediately picked up without even ringing by an elderly lady. The lady said hello, and Crystal asked whether Amelia was there. Amelia was a cousin of her friend. The elderly lady replied, "No dear, Amelia isn't here, sweetie. I should be expecting her any minute now." Crystal thought nothing of it and hung up the phone and thought she'd contact her later. When she finally caught up with her friend Jessica, she told her she'd tried to ring her at her cousin's Amelia's house, and Amelia's grandmother had answered the phone. Jessica went white and said, "Amelia's grandma is dead, and we were at the house all day long. We were also sitting close to the phone, and it never rang all day." Case number 6. In Easter 1997, Claire was holidaying in a 3-bedroom cottage in North Wales, which was owned by a friend's grandfather. The location of the cottage was fairly isolated but close to the main road. Although the cottage was basic, it did have electricity and a hot water system, but no heating. There were 6 people staying at the cottage, where they spent most of the time doing very little and visiting places of interest. One Saturday morning, they went to the local market and before returning to the cottage, decided to have lunch at a local pub. While they were having lunch, some friends of theirs came into the pub. They were staying in a cottage in a nearby town and said that they were glad they had not missed them and were still in town. Claire asked them how did they know where they were. They told her that they had phoned the cottage that they were staying at, and the lady answered the phone and told them where they would be. Claire told them that there was nobody else staying at the cottage, not even a cleaner or anyone else associated with the property. So who answered the phone and how did they know where they would be? Claire said that they spent the remainder of their stay at the cottage sleeping with all of the lights on and never returned there. Case number 7. Mary is a telephone sales representative and at the time of the incident was marketing a phone service. One afternoon she made a call to Pennsylvania, and when a woman answered the call, she asked to speak to a Mr. or Mrs. Butler. The woman identified herself as Mrs. Butler, so Mary continued with a normal sales call. Although she was interested in what Mary had to say, when it came to making a major decision, Mrs. Butler was hesitant and said it best she spoke to her husband. Mary attempted to continue discussing what they had to offer, but finally told Mary that her husband was happy with AT&T and would not want to change. She also said that since retiring, her husband spent much of his time fishing and would be difficult to get in touch with, and the best time to call would be in the morning. Mrs. Butler added that her husband often made long-distance calls to North Carolina and the cost was extremely expensive, and added that maybe a different phone plan may work out cheaper. After that last comment, Mary thought it would be worth calling them back and decided to call back the following morning. The following day, Mary called and was happy when Mr. Butler answered the phone. Mary explained to the man that she had called the previous day and had spoken to his wife about a new phone plan, but his wife suggested I discuss it with you instead. Mr. Butler said, I don't know who you were talking to, but my wife has been dead for over a year and I'm in no mood to speak to anyone, and immediately hung up.